2012 might not seem that long ago, but the world was a very different place back then. There was a different political situation for a start.
Tonight, more than 200 years after a former colony won the right to determine its own destiny, the task of perfecting our union moves forward.
The Olympics were held in London.
I declare open the Games of London, celebrating the 30th Olympiad of the modern era.
And Instagram released their app on Android devices.
Hey, this is Thomas from The Verge, and we're checking out the new Instagram app for Android, which is available today.
But in the world of football, something even more remarkable happened.
Das Team von Jürgen Klopp ist als Außenseiter in die Saison gegangen und hat mit Fußball 4.0 begeistert. Sie hat mit ihrer Philosophie...
A team named Bayern Munich didn't win the Bundesliga. Last week, Bayern confirmed that they would finish the season top of the table again.
And from on high, the gods look down on Bayern Munich once more, and they are crowned the champions.
The Bavarian club have now won 8 Meisterschalen in a row, raising questions about the league's attractiveness to foreign audiences. In this episode, we ask, is Bayern's dominance an issue for German football?
No surprises, but it could have been different.
Raphael Honigstein covers the Bundesliga for The Athletic, Der Spiegel, BT Sport and the Totally Football Show.
They started off so badly and the team, I think, were either consciously or subconsciously playing for the dismissal of Niko Kovac. And I think if Bayern had waited a little bit longer, then we might have seen a different outcome. Bayern is certainly vulnerable this year and last year, and I think it's a bit of a shame for Dortmund and perhaps others that they didn't take advantage.
Still 2 competitions to go as well, a Pokal final against Leverkusen in July, and then in August the Champions League is set to play itself out. Is a treble on the cards?
There's a possibility, which is more, I think, that could be said at the beginning of the season. No one, I think, really believed that Bayern could win the Champions League. I mean, Niko Kovac had done his best to talk down the team's possibilities. He said, well, you can't go 200 kilometers an hour on the Autobahn if your car can only do 100. And that didn't go down too well with the players. But kind of managed expectations. Now we're in a completely different situation where people are looking at the way the team has been playing and think there aren't that many teams in Europe that are at a similar level. Why shouldn't they win it? I guess the real question will be, how will they come out of this break? Would it work in their favour? Would it work against them that they'll have basically a month off after finishing the season? I guess we'll have to wait and find out.
Has Hansi Flick got Bayern playing at the same level that Pep Guardiola had them playing at?
I think it's a bit too early to say that. I think what you can say is that the performances have been some of the best we have seen in recent years, and that includes the Guardiola years. So if you're a Bayern fan, you're very encouraged by the kind of football, the quality, the style that Hansi Flick has been able to bring back. But history at Bayern gets written after the Champions League final, if they make it, not before. And for all the beauty, for all the quality that they achieved under Guardiola, and certainly again this season under Flick, it's ultimately not quite validated, if you will, unless they actually do go on and lift the European Cup. So we can only judge their position in history after the season's over.
This season felt like something of a watershed moment in German football for me, because if last season was about Bayern winning the league despite being at their lowest iteration for a long time, and the questions that raises about the Bundesliga's competitiveness, it seems as though this season was about that weak Bayern side being restored to their former glorious self. With that in mind, can you see anyone in German football disrupting Bayern's dominance in the next few seasons?
It's difficult to imagine them getting any weaker now that they have a manager that actually works. I've been saying throughout the last couple of years that this is Dortmund's year. It should have been this year, or it should have been last year. Last year they got quite close. They collapsed in the second half, still only finished 2 points adrift. This year it was the first half where they effectively wasted opportunity. I don't think you could really expect Gladbach and Leipzig to have the same kind of consistency with their squad. So Bayern this year pulled away because their form reverted to the mean, which is much higher, and the others couldn't catch up. Whether that will play out now for the next few years is difficult to say, because I think it'll depend a lot on how Hansi Flick will manage this team, especially if they win the Champions League, which might prove a problem going forward in terms of motivation. But unfortunately, the real chance, I think, it has already gone. Bayern will not be as weak or in transition as they have been over the last couple of years.
I'm really interested in the historical causality behind Bayern's rise to power. Reading Uli Hesse's book, Bayern Creating a Super Club, you get the sense that Bayern weren't exactly the likeliest club to become the biggest in Germany. They weren't even present in the inaugural Bundesliga in the 1960s, and they faced challenges to their supremacy from teams like Gladbach, Hamburg, Köln, Kaiserslautern, and obviously more recently Borussia Dortmund. A mention should also be made of Berlin never really becoming an influence in German football because of the East-West divide. What do you think the historical explanations are for why Bayern ended up where they are now?
Well, there are a lot of reasons for that. The first point I would make is to go back to your question. You're absolutely right. I mean, Bayern weren't considered prominent and relevant enough to be included when the Bundesliga was set up. In 1860, there was already a team from Munich present who'd been historically more successful, and no one thought it necessary to include Bayern, and it took them a couple of years before they were actually promoted. And of course, it's almost as if they had a point to prove ever since, trying to avenge that slight, if you will. The reasons for the dominance, I think, there are 2 or 3 basic reasons, and they all come together. The first reason is, I think, that they got very lucky at a time when the quality of a football team was directly influenced by the players that they had, because they couldn't really buy anyone. They managed to both produce, but then also buy players from the immediate surroundings that turned out to be world-class players.
Beckenbauer, more Zugang into Beckenbauer, in the net, Beckenbauer scored!
Franz Beckenbauer is from Munich, Gerd Müller was not from too far away, Franz Roth, an hour outside Munich, Paul Breitner, an hour outside Munich, Schwarzenbeck from Munich, Sepp Maier from Munich. And you had the spine of a world-class team there. That was the first, if you will, lucky coincidence. Then the next, I think, big turning point for Bayern was the Olympic Stadium being built.
Meine Damen und Herren, in wenigen Minuten werden über 70 Fernseh- und Radiostationen aus aller Welt mit der Übertragung aus dem Münchner Olympiastadion beginnen.
Again, at a time when football teams didn't own their own grounds, certainly it's in Germany, suddenly the city of Munich has an 80,000-seater stadium, or 80,000 capacity. There's a lot standing at the time. And of course, Gates' receipt was the number one income. So you go from a small stadium that you had to share with 1860 to being able to play in the Olympic Stadium just at the time when you also, as Bayern Munich, begin to dominate and win titles and then go on to win European Cup a few times. All these things come together. And then through the cleverness of Uli Hoeneß, the Bayern president, who then was the general manager and very young general manager, understanding where football was going in terms of the TV rights, importance in terms of the commercialization of the game, cutting deals, making Bayern a brand, 100 different small decisions which ended up as this all-encompassing master plan, almost by default, which ultimately no one can compete with. To give you one example, perhaps, is at the beginning of the 2000s, late 90s, local reporters would get a list from the Bayern press office with all the mobile phone numbers from the players, because the club wanted the players to be in the media. They encouraged stories being written. And I think that is, even though it's only a small part of the story, part of the reason why Bayern just have been able to build on the dominance with every year becoming more and more unassailable.
Much of Bayern's success is born of their financial strength, and you've already mentioned the importance of someone like Uli Hoeneß to the economic side of Bayern. It's easy to think of Bayern as being a bit of an economic powerhouse in many respects, but in the mid-80s under Willi Hofmann, Bayern themselves were on the brink of financial liquidation. And I'd be interested to hear from you how Bayern and Uli Hoeneß managed to avoid these problems.
The story of Bayern is the story of a club being taken over by its players, which is quite unique. In 1979, Uli Hoeneß was made general manager, and in Paul Breitner, they basically had a player manager, and the two of them called the shots at Bayern. Soon later, the president resigned because Bayern as a club had basically said, we don't want this new coach that you've appointed in Max Merkel. We as a team just say no. And that was the beginning of Bayern being led by Uli Hoeneß. And he had, because he had a business acumen, got a sponsorship deal at a time when sponsoring was still in its infancy. And he managed to raise money, and he managed to be influenced by the American system of merchandising, which was still unheard of in the late 70s, early 80s. But all of those things didn't really help Bayern make up the deficit that they had amassed in a few years of relative lack of success. They've only won a couple of titles since the early 70s. There was a sort of a renaissance in 79, 18, 80, 81, but it wasn't sustained. There were still lots of other champions at the time in German football, and the TV money hadn't started coming in. What they had to do was sell their best player. Now, luckily, they had one of the best players in the world, not far off Maradona at the time, in Karl-Heinz Rummenigge. And they sold him to Inter for a price, I think that was initially 8.3 million marks, but then went up to 10 or maybe 11 with all the add-ons. And that one deal saved Bayern from, maybe not bankruptcy, but certainly from serious financial problems, and put them in a position where they could reinvest. And it's soon after that, when Udo Latte comes back as a coach, they start winning 3 titles in a row at the time when suddenly TV money starts being a factor, and they never looked back since then.
Leeds United scored a goal, which the referee disallowed for offside. It was a goal. It wasn't offside. But that often happens in football.
In Germany, there is a phrase, Bayern-Dusel, which references the fact that a lot of non-Bayern fans think that Bayern get quite lucky in games. Now, as a Leeds fan, I've been all too aware of the 1975 European Cup final between Leeds and Bayern, which many Leeds fans seeing as being unfairly given to Bayern due to refereeing decisions. There was a whole series of 3 European Cup finals won by Bayern between 73 and 76. Each of these finals have been described as being lucky in some sense, and I'm interested in how important these finals were in cementing Bayern's emerging dominance.
There was certainly a huge element of luck involved in all 3 finals, or 3 out of the 4 finals, if you count the Atletico Madrid first game, which they drew through a shot from Katja Schwarzenbeck in the 119th minute. A guy who never scores suddenly shoots, and you see Gerd Müller kind of waving, saying, please don't shoot, but he shoots, and somehow the ball bobbles in with Pepe Reina's father in goal. And the legend has it that he was being talked to by a Spanish photographer who'd already asked him about his kit, and he's been momentarily distracted, but he always denied that version. Of course, in the second leg, Bayern absolutely destroy Atletico Madrid, but then again, as you said, in Leeds, controversial refereeing decisions, Bayern getting lucky, and again against Saint-Etienne, story repeating itself, and also Bayern getting away with it to a certain extent. The Bayern-Dusel, I think, is something that happens a little bit later, when Bayern start winning consecutive leagues and they're kind of the dominant force, that people are beginning to notice that this is a team that scores late goals, a little bit like Man United. But whereas Man United, I think the narrative is about a team that doesn't give up and they don't know where they're beaten. With Bayern, the knee-jerk reaction is that they're lucky, there's something lucky about them. In 2020, I think the discussion has moved on to the point where people have realized that a team that creates a lot of chances has a better chance of getting lucky later on. And perhaps all this luck isn't just luck. But also, curiously, their bad record in the Champions League / Europa League finals since those 3 triumphs have kind of changed the perception a little bit, because Bayern have been routinely getting unlucky in finals. It's almost as if all the good luck has been used up. Losing in 82 in ridiculous fashion, 87 again, 99 everybody knows about, 2010, okay, that's probably the odd one out because Inter was simply better, but in 2012, I mean, the classic example again of a team just still don't understand how they lost the game. I think it's less of a genuine held belief or superstition. And I think it's more used in inverted commas, almost as a kind of ironic and knowing cliche these days.
Of course, there's another form of luck in football, which is just being in the right place at the right time. And here in England, I think many people feel that way about Manchester United under Alex Ferguson. Yes, there were savvy business decisions. Yes, there were good managerial decisions. But they were also just lucky to have been dominant at a key juncture in the history of football, where the economics of the game was suddenly taking off. Would you say Bayern were also lucky in that sense?
It's hard to separate cause and effect, but they certainly were in a position to benefit from the new football economy that was beginning to emerge in the mid-80s, where suddenly there were German games live on television courtesy of commercial channels that hadn't been around a few years before. Suddenly there was money to be made in the European Cup because you could sell your own games. That's how Dortmund briefly became a challenger, because they had a fantastic run in UEFA Cup and made loads of money, and then won the Champions League, and suddenly they were really flush. I mean, there was huge money to be made in this bonanza. To go back just a second to the 76 final, I read that Wilhelm Neudecker, when they qualified for the final, said, "Oh, we're losing money again," because if they counted all the bonuses that they had to pay the Bayern players, I think they were on 50,000 marks for reaching the finals. And the cost of going there, basically Bayern lost money on the night. So that's, that's how things have changed. But they managed to dominate both the sporting landscape, but also the agenda. And I think it's almost as important that through deliberately buying players that were superstars, by almost courting that controversy, by being deliberately polarizing, they made Bayern relevant. You either hate them or you love them, and Bayern force you to have an attitude and to have an opinion, and that translates into eyeballs, and that translates into the stadiums being full, and that translates into people tuning in either because they like to see you lose or because they like to see you win. And they just perfected that brand image, if you will, of the ABB, anything but Bayern. And they have now the most fans by far in Germany, way beyond Munich, but also the most people who would absolutely define themselves through hating Bayern. And that's exactly where they want to be.
Are you a fan of football today? Why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full and unedited interviews, and lots more extra content. To join us, just visit patreon.com and search for Football Today. Now back to today's episode. So, is Bayern's dominance bad for the Bundesliga?
I don't think there's any doubt that the Bundesliga would benefit from more competition at the top. Everybody wants to have a title race. Everybody wants to have 3 or 4 Bayerns, ideally 6. Part of the reason why the Premier League continues to dominate international audiences and the international agendas, because there isn't just one Bayern, there's a few. Unfortunately, there's not a lot Bayern themselves can do about it. Their dominance has, for want of a better word, grown organically. Yes, there's been strategic deals being made, but in theory, anyone could do these deals if they were interesting enough to minority investors. Unfortunately, not many clubs are. It's a little bit like saying, I'm the Black Forest. What can I do about the Amazon rainforest? Can I cut them down? Not really. Is there a way that I can grow and be as big as the Amazonas? No, not really. So we're kind of stuck in a situation where there's just one monster and everybody else is playing catch up. I don't think it necessarily translates into Bayern winning 8 titles in a row, because they have made mistakes. But unfortunately, Dortmund, despite very serious growth in financial and in sporting terms, weren't able to take advantage. And I think it would have been much better for everyone concerned if they had been able to do it. But unfortunately, they didn't. And I think we have to live with this debate.
So what's the solution?
There's no easy way out of it, because I think this is something that non-German listeners don't fully appreciate. We don't have the situation in the Bundesliga where people are hoping that they will be bought by Saudi Arabia or Russian or the Chinese government, even if it meant being competitive and being suddenly the new Bayern Munich. They wouldn't want it. A majority of fans, a vast majority of fans, are not prepared to relinquish control of the club through the 50+1 membership structure and that degree of accountability that exists within those structures for the price of being more competitive and winning more trophies. It might change one day with a new generation, but right now, if you ask the ordinary Schalke fan on the street, the ordinary Eintracht Frankfurt fan, the ordinary Werder fan, you'd always get the same answer. No, some things are more important than silverware. And being a club with club structures and having no ownership and no outside investment is more important to us. And until that changes, it's very difficult to see how Bayern's dominance can be really challenged.
So you think that financial levelling is the only solution here then?
I don't see any other way. There's lots of debates about TV money distribution becoming more equitable, or maybe turning it on its head that, the winner gets the least amount of money and the team who gets last should get the most. I think it's really worth considering and evaluating those ideas. From a very cursory look at the numbers, I would suggest it doesn't really make much of a difference. Right now, the difference between the first and the last in the Bundesliga is about 40 million euros in terms of TV money. If you turn that on its head, you might have more competition within the league, but it doesn't change anything about the fact that Bayern will turn over 750 million euros next year. So those 20 million euros you might take away from them from the domestic TV rights money and give it to the 16th best team. Instead, it doesn't really, I think, move the needle. You would have to then redistribute the Champions League money as well. And then you quickly get into a situation where perhaps it's more beneficial not to play well because you get more money if you don't get into the Champions League or finish 16th rather than 6th. So it has a problematic knock-on effect. So I don't think, as much as it would be the easiest solution, just push a button, that it's going to be enough to really change Bayern's dominance.
Do you think that the DFL or the DFB should have done more to prevent Bayern's dominance?
Well, the German FA are not in charge. It's the Bundesliga. The German FA control the third division, control the amateur football, control the national team, but they have no say in what happens in Bundesliga 1 and 2. That's the DFL, the league's corporate body. They're not in a position to do anything. I don't think they really care. They care about good players being produced, and there is a theory that a strong Bayern benefits the national team because then you have like a strong Bayern block of 6 or 7 players you can build a team around. And I guess if you look at some of the successful Germany teams, that is true, but some of them less so. 1990, there were some former Bayern players there, but a lot of them had already moved on and played in Italy by that time. So I don't know if it's always 100% correct. I think the Bundesliga themselves are conflicted because they understand that a strong Bayern, with all the negatives and the disadvantages, is still better than a weak Bayern and a competition that is seen as sportingly mediocre because Bayern don't do anything in the Champions League. And this is what I always say when people go, oh yeah, I'm not watching the Bundesliga because it's not competitive. Anyone can watch or not watch whatever league they want, but don't tell me you're not watching it because it's not competitive, because when it was competitive in 2004, 5, 6, 7, I'm sure you weren't watching. You didn't care about Bayern Munich and Dortmund then, and certainly not about Werder Bremen or Stuttgart who won the title. So what I'm trying to say is the visibility of Bayern, and to a lesser extent of Dortmund, is still more valuable to the league, and still at the end of the day gets more people to tune in than a weak Bayern, but a big competition. Because the big competition will not be seen as relevant if you don't see German teams continue doing well in the Champions League to validate the league.
The new number 9 at Bayern Munich. Robert Lewandowski officially presented to the press by sporting director Matthias Sammer. A transfer that has put a smile on the faces of everyone at Bayern.
Another argument given for Bayern's modern dominance is their tendency to buy strong players from the Bundesliga. If you look through the last 10 seasons, you'll see that every season Bayern are buying at least one player from a Bundesliga side, which strengthens them and weakens their opponent. How important is this to Bayern's position right now?
Of course, it cements the dominance. The ability to cherry pick German players absolutely helps. They don't have it all their way because now Dortmund are in a position where, certain players will say, I'd rather play for Dortmund. I can go to Bayern, but Dortmund is just as important to me, or I can see that I can fulfill my ambitions there. Reus would be a good example, maybe Brandt as well. But there are two sides to this. One, of course, it is ultimately very beneficial for Bayern if they can weaken the opposition and buy a good player at the same time. But the more important structural effect is that Bayern are in a position where they don't have to sell to anyone. Dortmund aren't. Dortmund know that an Aubameyang will leave. If he doesn't go to Bayern, he goes somewhere else. That Lewandowski will leave. He doesn't go to Bayern, he goes somewhere else. That Sancho will leave. That Haaland will leave one day. None of these guys will become Dortmund legends because unlike the Alabas and Müllers and Thiagos and Robins and Ribéry's of this world, they cannot be paid enough to stay. So even if Bayern tomorrow says, you know what, we no longer buy any Bundesliga players, no more, they still would get stronger because they can hold on to their players, they can bring through one or two talented youngsters, and they can buy 80 million players to sit them on the bench, like Lucas Hernandez, whereas everybody else is still selling. So the Bayern Dortmund thing, in the grand scheme of things, is no longer really relevant. The last player that got from Dortmund, who is still at Bayern, is Lewandowski in 2014, but it doesn't really change anything in the equation because Bayern start every season with 250 million euros more than Dortmund, and unless Dortmund find a way of making it up, it doesn't really matter whether that player goes to Bayern or he goes abroad. They keep battling to rebuild and build, whereas Bayern just managed to keep their strength. And again, it goes back to money.
So how long do you think it will be before we see Bayern unseated from their perch at the top of the Bundesliga?
Bayern appointed a coach that wasn't suited in Niko Kovac. They botched the transition of the team to a certain extent, but they got away with it. They had one of the poorest returns in terms of points of the decade, 78 points, but it was enough against the Dortmund team that completely collapsed in the second half of the season. I don't see that being played out under Hansi Flick as things are going, but at Bayern the stakes are very high. Let Bayern get knocked out in the quarterfinals, in the Champions League or in the semis, make that story repeat itself, and then again you'll be in the situation next year where Bayern will feel, okay, who's the manager who will get us over the line in the Champions League, and they might make a mistake. They might get the guy in who burns the whole club down and falls out with everyone, and big players don't want to play anymore, and then they have to rebuild again. So the structural advantage and the dominance allows them to make mistakes and rectify them, and that makes them too big to fail to a certain extent. But the gap isn't such that it's sort of inconceivable that they should have a bad season and somebody else will be better. The best way to gauge this in a maybe not objective but a maybe less Bayern-centric way is that the people in Dortmund in charge absolutely felt that with the squad that they had amassed this year, with Haaland, Sancho, Hazard, Can, Hummels, Brandt, and the list goes on, that they had a real shot at winning the title this year and that they blew it. They blame themselves rather than looking at Bayern's dominance. And as long as that feeling is sort of genuine, that people feel that they can do it, and if they don't do it, they look at their own mistakes first, I think there's still hope for everybody else.
You can catch Raphael Honigstein's coverage of the Bundesliga at The Athletic, Der Spiegel, BT Sport, and The Totally Football Show. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.